In the stifling hot month of July 1789, revolutionary fever sweeps the French capital. Paris and its population of 550,000 is faced with a massive influx of beggars desperately seeking work to escape poverty. The Kingdom of France has been in crisis for months. In political circles, the revolution is already underway. It is now the people's turn to revolt. Because the French are angry, they have had enough of inequality. Unemployment has exploded, the people are starving. 15 days before the storming of the Bastille, 16 of the king's regiments surround the city. These 30,000 armed men will swoop in to repress the Parisians if ever they revolt. The Parisians are infuriated. They panic.
Numbers of troops are being brought up by the government all around, and this creates an atmosphere of fear and danger as well. They are afraid that there will be what they used to call a military execution against Paris. These troops will be used to impose order in a very brutal way.
This climate of fear reaches a climax on the night of July 13th. The Parisians keep watch and quake. Some hold themselves up as if awaiting a storm. Barricades are hastily erected on the city's streets to prevent cavalry charges, but it is not sufficient.
The people rise up in Paris initially for defensive purposes. In other words, as the troops could swoop down on us, we have to protect ourselves, hence the barricades. But most importantly, we must arm ourselves.
Finding weapons at all costs to protect themselves is the Parisians' objective. On the morning of July 14th, around 10 a.m., some 7 hours before the Bastille falls, a crowd armed with pitchforks and pickaxes grows as it moves through the streets of Paris. Everyone heads in the same direction, the Hotel des Invalides. The Royal Army's wounded and elderly officers and soldiers are cared for here. But the thousands of rioters are after the weapons stored in its basement.
They turn up at the Hotel des Invalides. They break down the doors and hastily grab 32,000 rifles, 12 cannons. But something is missing.
There's no powder. There's no powder to fire the guns. So, you've got your rifle, but you can't use it because you don't have any powder and you don't have any shot. So what you've got to do is try and find places where there is powder, where there is shot, so these arms are of any use.
Powder and shot. The one place in Paris where huge amounts have been stored in the past few days is the Bastille in eastern Paris. It takes about half an hour to march from the Hotel des Invalides to the Bastille.
The Parisians know there is powder at the Bastille. The idea is not to take it over, but to force the governor to give powder to the insurgents.
At 10:30 a.m., the insurgents have absolutely no intention of attacking the Bastille. But in the next 7 hours, their attitude will change completely. Besides, how could they even consider attacking the supposedly impregnable fortress? The present-day Place de la Bastille is situated in the 11th district in eastern Paris. It is recognizable by this column, crowned with a golden angel. Nothing remains of the Bastille now. But at the time, this behemoth of a building dominated the skyline.
The place is imposing. It is a very tall and a very hostile building. It really dominates that part of the capital.
As tall as a 9-story building and as long as Notre Dame Cathedral, with 8 huge 11.3-meter wide, 24-meter high towers and 2-meter thick walls, the 37-meter wide, 68-meter long parallelepiped offered maximum security. Built in the 14th century, the Bastille was not always a prison. It was originally a royal castle, just like the Louvre.
The Bastille was built as a fortress to defend Paris, to defend the eastern approach to the city, because in France at that time, the enemies came from the east, and to provide a safe haven for the king.
In terms of safety and security, the Bastille's architects thought of everything. To get into it, you have to make your way to a first courtyard, guarded by soldiers. At the end of this courtyard, the entrance is protected by 2 drawbridges, one for carts, one for pedestrians. Once these bridges are lowered, you have to cross a bridge over an 8-meter deep, 25-meter wide moat. And then, a second dual drawbridge gives access to the inside of the Bastille itself. This veritable fortress is supposedly impregnable. But on the 14th of July, 1789, the Bastille did not prove to be an impenetrable bunker. Far from it. The Parisians' anger towards the kingdom's rulers was too great. We are at the Chateau de Versailles, 35 kilometers from Paris. The royal court is as yet unaware, but in a few hours' time, the people will storm the Bastille. The ruler of France, whose population was then 27 million, 35-year-old Louis XVI, was indecisive but popular with his subjects.
Pretty much everyone was loyal to the king, very loyal to him. He was seen as the father of the nation. There was always this family metaphor. The king ruled his subjects with love, but he could also punish them harshly. We mustn't forget that. Absolute monarchy became firmly established in France in the 17th century, and the monarchy was very authoritarian. The king was extremely powerful. He held all the power.
All the power was in the king's hands, legislative, executive, and judicial. This concentration of power was no longer acceptable to many in 18th century France, the age of enlightenment.
And that is precisely what the absolute monarchy was criticized for. Not the fact that it was a monarchy, but that it was absolute. In other words, the king's will was law. There was no system of checks and balances.
He was married to the Austrian Marie Antoinette, a queen suspected of not loving her subjects.
The good king and the bad queen. Marie Antoinette was loathed by the people, or at least very unpopular. They called her the foreigner. They reproached her love of luxury and her infidelity.
The fact is, the country was in dire financial straits. Its involvement in the American War of Independence, which started in 1776, had left it bankrupt. France was also in the throes of an economic crisis caused by appalling weather conditions that led to famine.
The harvests were very bad, so wheat prices surged and the cost of bread increased.
In spring 1789, for instance, the price of bread on Paris markets rose to 15 cents. You have to remember that the lowest wages for workers at the time were 20 cents. So 75% of the income of the poorest workers was spent on bread alone.
So even before the 14th of July, 1789, the French had revolted several times. For instance, 2.5 months before the Bastille was stormed, there was a riot at the Réveillon wallpaper factory. Thousands of Parisians attacked it after hearing rumors that the owner intended to reduce wages. They accused him of wanting to starve the people. The crackdown was brutal. 300 died. But the people did not stop there. In July, 4 days before the 14th, the Paris faubourgs erupted in flames. At the time, the capital was surrounded by a huge wall with 54 toll gates where taxes were collected on goods brought into the city. These were the octroi barriers.
The taxes were extremely unfair because they made daily life even harder for people who were already struggling, and the nobility were exempt from most taxes.
The fact they affected people's survival explains the violence of the revolts. It explains the resentment the people felt towards the ruling classes.
This resentment increased further when the Parisians heard Louis XVI had just taken a decision with serious consequences. On Sunday, July 12th, 2 days before the Bastille was stormed, many Parisians were strolling in the gardens of the Palais Royal. The gardens became a flashpoint.
For several weeks, patriots, those in favor of revolution, the opponents of royal absolutism, had been meeting in the gardens.
It's a popular place that people go to, and whoever, if you like, can shout loudest sometimes gets listened to.
And this indignant and passionate man was listened to. His name was Camille Desmoulins. He was just 29 years old.
He was a lawyer, without a cause, because he had a real impediment for a lawyer. He stuttered, and he lost his stutter by climbing on a table in the Café de Foix and stirring up the crowd. We have to fight back. The king is planning a St. Bartholomew for patriots. We're all going to be massacred by the troops amassed around the city. Take up arms, protest. He brandished 2 pistols.
The crowd applauded Desmoulins because they had just heard some spine-chilling news. The king had dismissed the finance minister, Jacques Necker, a very popular man known to be in favor of reform.
It meant that the king couldn't care less about them, and the crowd found that intolerable.
We can see that each time there's a kind of rejection of the king's arbitrary decision.
Desmoulins took a leaf from a tree and pinned it to his jacket, inviting his sympathizers to do the same. A sign loaded with meaning.
It shows you belong to a particular camp. It shows that during a revolution, you need to know who is who. And how to recognize your enemies. This was a time when people didn't know who supported the revolution. It really was the first cockade.
Green was soon abandoned, but the idea of the cockade remained. Initially in blue and red, the colors of Paris, and then with the addition of white, the colors of the French flag. The news of Necker's dismissal spread like wildfire through Paris. A huge crowd of several thousand men and women soon began to march in protest. On reaching the Tuileries Gardens, the king's troops charged the crowd.
This really was the last straw. The troops arrived to quell the protest, and in the process, they injured women and children, people who were out enjoying the fine July Sunday.
And it was this event that really prompted the Parisians to take up arms. It became an armed insurrection.